There is no shortcut to work done true and well. The creators learned this to their sorrow, the first time they made the world. Githry the Prisoner. Hey, what is up, everybody? Platform Disciple here with another Weird Card Wednesday. And if you are able to guess the name of this card based on the flavor text, count me as impressed, because the card is very obscure. It is Weird Card Wednesday after all. So the card is Nyx, and it is a rare printed in Future Sight, and that has not ever been reprinted yet, which is somewhat significant because Future Sight as a set had these bubbly, weird bordered cards, which I'm sure you're noticing. If you're not familiar with the set, that was an indicator that the card was going to be reprinted in the future. These cards were supposed to be cards that were from the future that were, traveled back in time to make their way into the set Future Sight, and that we would later see printed sometime in a set who knows how long into the future. But anyways, Nyx is one of those Future Sight cards that has yet to be printed again, so it's still, I guess, a card that's predicting its own reprint. But because of how obscure and strange the card is, there's no urgency behind printing it. So we'll have to wait and see how long it'll be before we ever see this card again. So let's get into why it's so obscure. The card's 1 blue mana, it's an instant, and the card text is counter target spell if no mana was spent to cast it. Of course, the original card says if no mana was spent to play it, but that terminology has since changed, so that in the official ruling has been changed to cast. But anyways, you probably haven't heard of this card because it is a hate card. It targets a specific type of card, which is what makes it a hate card, and the type of card that it is hating out is also obscure. So you have a obscure hate card for an obscure type of card, and that type of card is cards that are being cast without mana being spent on them. To be clear, that means it can counter cards that cost 0 outright, like Memnite or Pact of Negation, but it will also counter cards that were somehow cheated into being cast using some other kind of condition. The most notable is going to be Suspend, not because Suspend is a particularly prevalent ability, but this card, Nyx, came into existence when Suspend was a core mechanic of the block it was from, which is Time Spiral. So I'm just going to show you Thysis, and I have looked up the way to pronounce this card because, it looks like Thysis or something. There's a few different ways that it came up as how to pronounce it, but this seems to be the most prevalent one, which leads me to believe it's the correct way to pronounce it. So until you run into a language scholar, if this card ever comes up, it's Thysis. Anyways, that was a bit of a tangent there, but the card Thysis and many other cards have Suspend from the Time Spiral block, which allows you to pay a cost, which is not the spell's mana cost, to exile the card with time counters. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter. When the last time counter is removed, you can cast the card without paying its mana cost. So it's basically a way to pay for a spell early, typically at a discounted cost, and then you have to wait some amount of time before you actually get the payoff. But Nyx was a card that allowed you to counter those cards. I don't think it really saw very much play in Standard or anything, or any play at all, to be completely honest, but it was a card that was printed primarily with reference to these Suspend cards. But of course, Magic is a very different game from way back then, and there's lots of other types of cards that it can counter in many formats. So what we're really going to be doing in this video is kind of a case study of what this card can counter and why it matters or doesn't matter. Before we get into that, I am going to quickly mention that the spell cannot counter cards that were paid for with mana, which can be impacted by additional costs that are being added to those cards. So, great example here is God Pharaoh's Statue. spells your opponents cast cost 2 generic more to cast. If your opponent casts a Mem Knight and you have God Pharaoh's statue out, it's going to cost them 2 mana to play, which means that you cannot nix the Mem Knight. Kind of a fringe scenario, but it could come up. Likewise, if you have something that has a mana cost and has been discounted by something else, like let's say you have Jorah's Familiar in play, historic spells you cast costs 1 generic less, and you cast a 1 cost artifact, and you therefore spend 0 mana on it, it is open to be countered by Nyx. The last thing I will mention is that if the spell's cost is not increased, but there is an additional tax tagged onto the spell for some other reason, so an example would be Rhystic Study, gives you the option to pay an additional 1, but you're actually paying that additional 1 to a triggered ability that Rhystic Study has as opposed to cast the spell. So just keep in mind where those extra costs are coming from and whether they're being applied to the spell itself or whether it's part of some kind of triggered ability of another card. All right, let's begin by talking about this card in the most eternal of formats, Legacy and Vintage, and why it doesn't see play. So the biggest thing is that there's a lot of cards that kind of compete with this card in terms of what they do, as far as them doing kind of the same thing. So although there are lots of cards that cost no mana to cast that see play in Legacy and Vintage, the big example here is Force of Will, there are cards that are better at dealing with those cards than Nyx is, or more specifically are more flexible, because the difference between, so let's talk about the 2 big competitors here are Force of Will and Daze. Force of Will and Daze, they don't outright counter spells as effectively as Nyx does, potentially, where Force of Will and Daze, you have this kind of additional drawback attached to them for playing them at the low cost. But the thing is that Nyx can't target all kinds of spells, whereas Force of Will and Daze are very universal. Being universal is very important, and the question is, when would you want to run Nyx in addition to or instead of Force of Will and Daze? And the answer is, quite frankly, not really ever. And that's in large part because there are other spells that you can counter with Force of Will and Daze that Nyx can't. It's just not as universal. So let's move on to Modern, I suppose. Modern has a lot of spells that get cast without paying their mana cost as well. Some kind of big ones that are going to come up is Cascade as an effect. Bloodbraid Elf is a very powerful card in Modern just because it's very good, and you can nix the card that it cascades into. But also, I have mentioned on this channel Living End as a deck before, where you are using Cascade to flip Living End off of your deck and cast it without using its suspend mechanic. So Nyx can hit that as well. And in recent history, we've gotten a bunch of new cards in Modern that you can play without paying mana costs. So one is there's a whole new cycle of force cards like Force of Despair and Force of Negation. And then there's also, just recently at the Mythic Championship, it seems like Hogak is the card to beat in Modern right now. Hogak decks are popular and powerful, and Hogak literally has written on the card you can't spend mana to cast this spell, which means that it is an ideal target for Nyx. So the question is are all these cards kind of enough to make Nyx playable in Modern? And again, the problem is universality versus, the kind of niche hate card that Nyx is. If you're going to run counter spells, it's generally just better to run something that's going to hit more types of cards, because although I just mentioned a bunch of cards that can be played for free, or I guess for free in quotes, in Modern, The trouble is that no deck is running such a high density of free cards that it's worth running Nyx in. Like, if you're against a Hogak deck, sure, you can Nyx Hogak, but what about the other, 56 cards in the deck that are going to be, well, coming after you? Is Nyx really worth running just to hose Hogak specifically? And the answer is no. So we've kind of covered the competitive formats. What about in casual formats like Commander or Oathbreaker? In Commander and Oathbreaker, one thing that Nyx has going for it is that because those are singleton formats, you have the opportunity to run some more fringe cards, because instead of having to make the choice of putting in 4 Force of Wills or whatever versus 3 Force of Wills and a Nyx, you have Force of Will, but you still have plenty of room for other counter spells. But that being said, in both formats, the card is not seeing really any play. It's just so fringe. I don't think the card is necessarily bad. I think it's quite good at what it does, but what it does is so select in when it actually comes up that it's not really worth running ever, because you're just not going to run into these scenarios often enough. And even in those scenarios, there are cards that are just more universal that can address those scenarios in more or less the same way. So from a game design perspective, I think Nyx is an interesting card because it gets players thinking, but also Nyx serves as kind of like a last line of defense. It's a card that you don't ever want to see included in decks, because if it is included in decks, it's an indicator that free cards are just too prevalent and too powerful. And it's a last line of defense against those cards. If for whatever reason something like that gets out of hand, Nyx could come up. I think it's a card that we could see getting played sometime in the future, but if this card ever does get played competitively, it's an indicator that there's something unhealthy happening in the format that it's getting played in. So that just about does it for this Weird Card Wednesday, but as usual, I do have a card alter giveaway. This one is not what I usually do. I wanted to try doing a original piece of artwork painted, which is very difficult for me. I haven't done it really ever, to be honest. So I don't know how I feel about the results. I think it looks cool. I'm not unhappy with it or anything, but on the other side of the coin, I can see that I could have done a lot better, and I'm looking forward to giving my best effort another time around to see if I can improve. I also did include my new signature on the card, which I'm going to be putting kind of on my altars, just my it's a P and a D for Platform Disciple, just for giggles, and it'll help people who receive the cards from me actually remember where they got it from in case they somehow forget. But that does it. If you want to have a chance at winning this card, please join the giveaway in the description below, and I am going to throw it out there. It would be very helpful to me if you like the video or comment on it. I am trying to increase my videos' visibility because I do think that the content I'm making is good, but there aren't that many eyeballs on it, and I would just like to see some new people on the channel. All right, until next time, everybody. Have a nice day. Peace out.